Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. The human body has come under attack from secular culture in some strange and even disturbing ways in recent years. The nature and purpose of the body, female and male, was once considered obvious. Now, unfortunately, it is up for grabs, a sad reality we saw play out in some events in the 2024 Summer Olympics. The Word on Fire Institute sought to address this confusion surrounding the body in our recent Wonder Conference, Nature and the Human Body. Drawing on rich theological, philosophical, scientific, medical, moral, political, technological, and artistic resources, the conference sought to reclaim an authentic understanding of and deep appreciation for the body, for its resilience and its fragility, its joys and its suffering, its transcendence and its temporality, and above all, its wonder. Here to discuss the ongoing significance of the theme of this year's Wonder Conference is Bishop Robert Barron. Welcome back to the studio, Bishop.
Always good to be with you, Matt.
So today's topic, we're going to be recapping the Wonder 2024 conference. But before we do, just speak to us a little bit about the significance for you of being able to have the conference in your own diocese.
Yeah, I'm very pleased about that. The first one was in Dallas, wasn't it, about a year and a half ago. And then we thought, well, yes, to make it easier for me, I suppose, is part of the thinking. You know, I wouldn't have to take another trip.
Right.
But, you know, Rochester, Minnesota is a great scientific city because you've got arguably the most important medical center on the planet right here in this city. So I've always liked just the resonance of that. And obviously, as the bishop of this diocese, you know, I was very proud to host that conference.
There was a stunning turnout. I mean, a lot of people came not only from the regional area, but from across the country, even internationally as well.
Yeah, I was very pleased with that. And there was a great buzz around the whole meeting. I was there, you know, kind of in and out for different things, but just the enthusiasm among the participants was remarkable. I do think people realize the importance of this topic.
Right.
That religion and science is a major, you know, obstacle for a lot of people. So they realize we need to keep looking at it.
Well, we're going to get into the topic in just a moment. The theme of the conference was nature and the human body. But tell us a little bit about the genesis of the Wonder Conference itself, why you thought it was necessary, this kind of event in the first place.
Yeah, if you want to go way back, I think of a time I stood up in Los Angeles at the famous Religious Education Congress, where you've got, you know, huge numbers of writers, publishers, religious educators, teachers, all that. And I had just been studying at that time a lot of the data about disaffiliation. And time and again, you'd hear, I left because religion and science are incompatible. I left because I discovered through science that the Bible is nonsense, et cetera. So I stood up at that. It wasn't my topic that day at all, but I stood up before and I just said, all right, could I please ask all the science teachers in this room to stand? And there were a lot of them. Then I said, now, keep standing. Could all the religion teachers stand? And of course, there were a lot of them. Then I paused dramatically and I said, all right, you all need to talk to each other. I said, because that is a problem, that within the Catholic framework itself, the religion people and the science people weren't in conversation. You know, why not have the religion teacher come into the science class and vice versa? Right. So anyway, I think that very day I said something like, I would love to sponsor a major, you know, convention around this issue, and the room filled with applause. So that was the deep origin of the Wonder Conference.
I think you've made it clear throughout all of the work that you do why science and the faith are not in conflict. Can you say a little bit more about why it's not just a matter of they're not in conflict, but they're actually mutually complementary?
Of course, and go back to Pope Benedict's famous Regensburg address, where he insisted Jesus being called the Logos is of extraordinary significance. The early church, Ratzinger said this in an earlier book, opted for Logos over mythos. Very interesting.
Yeah.
It opted for logic, philosophy if you want, over the mythological tradition in explaining Jesus. When you say he's the Logos made flesh, right away you've linked him to philosophy, to culture, to science, to anything that deals with Logos, with meaning or with rationality. And so built into Christianity is the compatibility of religion and science, if you want. You know, I'll speak as an American, and it's roughly 100 years ago, the famous monkey trial, the Scopes trial in our country became like a meme, and it set the tone for so much of the conversation. But that was born of kind of a weird Protestant fundamentalism And then you have the rising sciences meeting this very, defensive and I would say rather unintelligent form of Christianity. But that still haunts the Western and more particularly American imagination. We need to get beyond the monkey trial. That's a really bad meme. Or I go back when I was a kid, the Inherit the Wind, the famous play that was made into a movie with the great Spencer Tracy and Frederick Marsh. And it's a fun movie to watch.
Yeah.
But it comes out of that matrix of heroic, scientific rationalist against these obscurantist, backward religious people. But see, that's not a Catholic understanding at all of either religion or science. But our culturally Protestant country was very much shaped by that conversation to our detriment. So I want to get beyond the stupid monkey trial.
I think it's not very well known just how recent that fundamentalist theology
100
appeared
years ago.
on the scene.
Yes.
And how it really kind of came from nowhere.
No, that's quite right. And it's an aberrant form, if you want, of Protestantism.
It is, yeah.
And it flourished, as you say, let's say 100 years or longer in our country ago. But we need to get past that moment because it has unhappily influenced the way we think about this issue.
So again, the theme of the conference was nature and the human body, and you gave the opening keynote with the goal of sort of laying the conceptual foundation for all the subsequent keynotes and talks. Tell us a little bit about how you framed it and why you framed it in the way you did.
Yeah, I put in terms really of the body-soul conversation, which is a very old one. I commenced, though, with something that we're all familiar with now, which is the increasing number of younger people who say, I'm ill at ease in my body, right? That who I really am doesn't correspond to what my body is. And I said, okay, that's got a particular accent today, but that's a very old problem of if you want the soul or the mind or the self in some kind of tension with the body. And I began with, with the Bible, which insists upon the compatibility of, you might say, the earthly and the heavenly, so that we're made from the dust of the earth. It's a very important claim of the Bible, that these bodies of ours indeed come out of the elements of this world. They connect us to everything else in the physical universe. Remember years ago when I was a kid, Carl Sagan, we're all star stuff. Our molecules were cooked inside of stars. Fair enough. I mean, that's the biblical thing. We come from the dust of the earth. But then the Lord breathes into the nostrils of Adam, the ruach, right, we hear in the Bible, the breath. And I suggest you don't think of that so much as the breath that coming in and out of our lungs, but it's a participation in the heavenly. So ruach gets rendered as pneuma in Greek and then spiritus in Latin. Well, spirit, right? There's something of the spiritual is breathed into us. And it's that hybrid, that union of body and soul that we are, right? Well, then I suggested you look at the Platonic philosophical tradition, so commencing with Plato and then coming up through the Western tradition in all sorts of ways. You have this idea of the tension between body and soul. The soul is imprisoned in the body. The soul longs to escape from the body. Think of the parable of the cave. Think of the Phaedo in the Apology when Socrates lays out this vision. He's longing for the spiritual realm. He can escape from the material. I argue that comes roaring up through Gnosticism. You see it in Albigensianism. And you see it, I argued, in the modern philosophers. You see it in someone like Descartes, for whom you have the realm of thinking things, like this interior, soulful realm, and then the realm of extended things out there in space. Two radically different metaphysical orders. And then I suggested to the audience, there's a better way to think about this that is actually more biblical, and identified it with the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. And I'll sum it up this way. The soul is not a prisoner in the body, not set over and against the body, the real me as opposed to my body, but rather the soul is in the body, as Thomas says, as not contained by it, but as containing it. That the soul, you might say, is at a higher pitch of ontological perfection, and it can include the body. It's the form of the body, the first principle of a living thing, Aristotelian language. But Aquinas can adopt all that within a Christian perspective. That's a healthier way to think about body-soul. Another phrase I left with the folks to think about is Aquinas says, anima mea non sum ego. It's actually his commentary on 1 Corinthians, that little phrase. It means, I'm not my soul. Now see, contrast that to a kid today saying, well, the real me is out of step with my body.
Right.
Well, see, that's kind of assuming that I am my soul. I'm like this inner thing someplace, and the body is out there. When Aquinas says, anima mea non sum ego, I'm not my soul, I am the union of body and soul. So I can't, as it were, take a position outside my own body and say, okay, now I need to change that or manipulate that to bring it into line. You might feel that way, but that's more of a distortion, you know? That's a Platonic, Gnostic sort of distortion. And the Thomistic Aristotelian, and ultimately I'd say biblical view, helps us get away from that. So there's my talk in about a 4-minute
Sure,
nutshell.
and another one of the errors that you pointed to is to conceive of the soul as a kind of ghost within the machine.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of people, you know, even including Christians, would say, well, yeah, we're not separate, our body and soul are not separate, but yet it's kind of like there's the spiritual me inside of this material me. But you say that's not it?
No, see, that's a Cartesian version of the Platonic problem. So for Plato, I'm a prisoner inside a prison. It was Gilbert Ryle in the 20th century who gave us that term, ghost in the machine, but he meant to use that to describe Descartes' position, I think quite accurately. There's this machine, and that's very modern, this sort of mechanistic thing, the body, and then there's this mysterious ghost that's in there somehow. How's it related to it? Well, I'm not really sure, but that's a very Gnostic, very Platonic way of thinking about it. But how readily it comes into the imaginations of people today. That, oh, of course, there's the real me and then there's my body.
Yeah.
But that's a very weird way of talking. It's not biblical, not Aristotelian, not Thomistic, which are much healthier because they honor the unity of the self, you know? Like if I, you know, catch my finger on something, I don't say, oh, you know, my finger hurts. I say, I hurt, I'm in pain, right? I can't separate the body out as like an appendage to my soul, to the real me. And by the same token, you know, we're having this sort of high-level conversation. Well, I'm having it. And that includes my body. Because look what I just did. See, my body was responding to what you're saying, what I'm saying. Because I am a unit. I'm a unity. I am not my soul. So that was the sort of focus of my talk.
Some may hear this and say, well, this is fascinating, but it's really at an abstract and theoretical level, and it's not exactly clear how we can connect this to our ordinary real lives. But your talk also pointed to the direction how practical it is. What are some of the dangers of getting this relationship between body and soul wrong?
Well, you see it every day. I mean, you see it in the rhetoric of younger people, and you see it in the disassociation that people feel. And unfortunately, sadly, it's being encouraged by a lot of people in authority today. Like that disassociation, oh sure, that's natural. And so now you have the prerogative to bring your body into line with what you think your real self is. Well, now the body's been instrumentalized. My own body has become a kind of instrument of this ghost in the machine. Well, then I end up with this deeply fractured self. And that's why, I am such an opponent of this gender ideology, which allows for very young people to say, oh no, I'm not really a man, I'm a woman, so I'm going to change my body accordingly. Talk about the psychological and spiritual disorders that will flow from that we think that's going to solve a young person's psychological problems. On the contrary, it seems to me. So, right, it's anything but simply theoretical. It has a massively negative impact.
Is there any danger that this conception of me being in relationship to my body and the body kind of being matter for me to manipulate according to my will, is there a danger that could be extrapolated to reality as a whole?
Sure. Yes, and you see, press it now, the sort of godlike self, which we see in some forms of modernity. I think you see it today, because we're post-Nietzscheans. I mean, if God's dead, what's left? Well, there are no objective values. They don't hold sway over us. It's my will. Look at Jean-Paul Sartre. I mentioned Sartre, in fact, in the talk, as the last example of the Platonic influence, because existence precedes essence. That means my freedom comes first, and then I decide who I am. Look at Casey versus Planned Parenthood, if you want to see 1992. It belongs to the very nature of liberty to determine the meaning of one's existence and of the universe. Well, I mean, you now have become God. We're all these little gods who have the prerogative of determining our reality. That's led to a deep sickness in our society, I think. God help us. And so, first of all, the splintering of the society. You're a God, I'm a God, we're all gods. And who can adjudicate between us? Well, nobody. I got to tolerate you, you got to tolerate me at all costs. Well, what we have then is the war of all against all.
Right.
There's going to be this warfare of the gods. But when there's the one God who creates the world and displays the values within it, and together we acknowledge those, now we can actually come together, So no, there are massive implications for all this.
Yeah, we all get to live in one reality if there's one true God.
Yeah.
So another one of the keynote speakers was Dr. Heather Hine, who gave, she's an evolutionary biologist, author, and educator, and she gave a talk called Grounded in Nature, an Evolutionary Framework for the Body. And before we move on to talking about some of the highlights in her talk, how should we respond to the critique, which I've actually seen pop up online, that Word on Fire Catholic ministries should not give a platform to an evolutionary biologist at all?
This was so much nonsense. I mean, why not? Catholic theology does not commit us to some sort of, mythological or anti-scientific view of the development of the body. When it comes to how does the body develop biologically, I'm not going to listen to, let's say, an ancient philosopher. I'll listen to a contemporary scientist. So there's no contradiction whatsoever between that. On the contrary. So faith and reason, and reason in its scientific form, we take seriously. So no, I have no time for that criticism.
I think it's important to note that oftentimes we think of the critiques coming from outside of the church on faith and the relationship between faith and science, but sometimes they can come from within the church as well.
But people ill-informed about the nature of Catholic teaching on faith and reason. Thomas Aquinas was using the best science of his time. Now a lot of that science is outmoded, and so we're not beholden to the science that Aquinas used. But we should use the best science of our time to understand the physical world. I've resisted for years a scientism that reduces knowledge to the scientific, but respecting the sciences is not scientism.
So let's now turn to the substance of Dr. Hine's talk. What really was salient for you?
Yeah, I think it was the interconnectedness of all things. She was good at just showing, the kind of the tree of life and how forms of biological life have evolved in different families and how they're related. But it was the commonalities among all the living forms. And as I said before, I think that confirms the biblical intuition that we're made, in the poetic language of the Bible, from the dust of the earth, meaning from the stuff, from the substance of the world. And we are cousins to all living things, closer cousins to some than others, but we're related. And that, to me, is also a deeply biblical idea. Look in the book of Genesis, we often overlook this, that salvation, the story of salvation, begins with creation. So it happens in the context of the whole of creation. Jesus' resurrection is not just for us, it's for the whole world. It's the renewal of nature. It's the repairing of a fallen world in the full sense of that term. The Bible is a very cosmological text. The pre-moderns knew that. You go back to the fathers, Aquinas knew it, Bonaventure knew it, the Gothic cathedrals embody it. With the modern turn, the subjective turn, the anthropocentric turn, everyone became much more human-centric.
Right.
But I love that about the pre-moderns. They weren't. They saw the cosmic implications of revelation.
That's right, we're embedded in the cosmos.
Yeah.
So your talk laid out the conceptual foundations at a sort of a high-level theological and philosophical level and biblical level. Dr. Hine was looking, as you say, at that deep empirical analysis. What's a principle that we can appeal to link those two so that we don't see them as just sort of two separate approaches to the same question?
I would say logos. Again, go back to Ratzinger. If the logos is the principle by which God makes the whole universe, then everything in the universe is marked by intelligibility. The sciences, in all their expressions, depend upon this intuition. What she was laying out to us, well, you might say, was the great intelligible structures of the biological world and how they manifest themselves. Well, that right away links you to the logos through which God makes the world, the logos that became flesh in Christ, etc. So no, logos is the key, and that St. John, in the prologue of his gospel, used that term. Philo, there are overtones there. There's kind of a Greek sense of it. There's a biblical sense for sure, an Old Testament sense. But that was a pivotal moment that he used that term. That in the beginning was the Word, and then the Word became flesh. Everything will flow from that in the way Catholics understand the relation between the various sciences and revelation.
You already gestured towards this, but something I found fascinating in her presentation was just how deeply related we are to other forms of life at the strictly biological level in terms of our bone structure and our muscle structure. And it's fascinating. At the same time, how do we recognize our relationship with other forms of life in a way that doesn't get reduced to a crass form of materialism?
Yeah, right. There's a difference. And we talked about earlier, we're made from the dust of the earth, but then the Lord has breathed His ruach, His Spirit, into us. So it's our participation in the mind of God. And so now we talk about intelligence, about will, about moral responsibility, about freedom, about creativity, all these things that make us distinctively human. It doesn't mean we're apart from the body. No, the soul's in the body, not as contained by it, but as containing it. It's like at a higher pitch of existence. But we don't reduce our human being to the merely biological. There's more than that. There's all of that, and there's more than that, is the right way to think about it.
So another one of our speakers was the public intellectual and well-known artist, Jonathan Pageau. He gave a talk on the body as a symbol and the symbol of the body, and offered a really insightful analysis of the creation of human beings from the perspective of the book of Genesis. But you actually got to speak to him in depth in a Bishop Barron Presents episode before the conference. Say a little bit about what you talked about.
Yeah, well, he's an interesting guy, Jonathan. I came to know him through the Jordan Peterson world, because he's part of that circle. We were on, I think it was a conversation with Peterson, John Vervaeke, and Pageau, and myself. So I first met him, on screen. Then I was on his podcast show, so we had a little more intense conversation. Then I finally met him in person. It was in Rome last year. We were doing some filming, and he was there. So, and then we just finished the one, as you say, last week here. He's Orthodox. He came out of a more fundamentalist Protestant background, found that for different reasons unsatisfactory, discovered Orthodoxy, discovered the church fathers, began to read the Bible now in a more appropriate way, moving out of a literalistic, framework, into this richly symbolic world of the church fathers. And that's why I find him a very compelling reader of the biblical stories. I told him at the end of our talk, I said, hey, your next book should just walk us through the New Testament maybe, just open up those stories for us. So we talked a lot about that. We talked about our own, formation. I came up in the age of Catholic liberalism, so not Protestant fundamentalism, but another thing very much shaped by modernity is Catholic liberalism, with its own limitations. I didn't get a really good way to read the Bible, because we got the historical critical method. And I kind of stumbled on the church fathers too later on. And so we had that in common, and then found the Bible opened up in this really fresh, powerful way. So we talked about a lot of those things.
So Fox News covered the event, the conversation that you had, and another salient theme was your discussion of sort of the condition for the possibility of science as an empirical enterprise. And they quoted you saying this. I'd like to just extrapolate it on a little bit. So you said, when it comes to materialism isn't something the sciences yield.
Yes.
Materialism is a philosophy, it's a philosophical view, and it's ultimately incoherent. And then you continue, you cannot be a scientist and not believe, at least implicitly, in the invisible. That is to say, the purely intelligible pattern. That's a fascinating claim. Extrapolate on that a little bit.
And Pageau and I both feel strongly about that, because he's interested in patterns too. And I would call them objective intelligibilities. All of science rests upon it. You cannot be a scientist, whether you're a physiologist, you're a biologist, you're a psychologist. Look at that little word, by the way, hidden there, logos all the time.
Yeah,
logos.
it's all in there, right?
Because every scientist is looking for intelligible patterns. We're taking in the world the data of our senses, but then what the scientist looks for, invariably, are intelligible patterns, right? Well, see, a pattern is in itself immaterial. Aristotle would have named it as a form, right? Morphe. It's not itself material. That's why he distinguishes between matter and form. The pure pattern is an immaterial intelligibility. So that's why I say materialism is self-defeating. If you say, my scientific view is completely materialistic, well, you can't be a scientist then. You'd be dealing with what Aristotle would have called prime matter. Well, prime matter is unformed. That means you can't know it in any way, right? And then that point I made about materialism is a philosophy, not a science. In other words, you'll never get the view that all there is in being is material from an analysis of the material world. You can analyze the material world all you want. You can hypothesize about it, do experiments upon it, and all that. But the claim that, well, that's all there is to reality, that's not itself a scientific claim. That's a philosophical claim. And you might be sort of cajoling yourself into that, but you've got to make a philosophical case for that. And in fact, I argued, you can't, because it's an incoherent position. It's like in logical positivism, when you say, well, all that's real and meaningful is what can be empirically verified. And you say, well, where did you empirically verify that
exactly,
statement?
Right. Yeah.
So logical positivism just turns on itself. It swallows itself up. The same is true, I think, of philosophical materialism. And I think we religious people, and not just religious, I think we coming out of a philosophical framework should keep making that argument, because especially younger people today, they're bamboozled by that. Oh, of course, the scientists are so wonderful and they're so successful and they've given us cell phones. And so, of course, that's all there is to the world. That doesn't follow at all. And the scientists are wonderful. They are very productive. But it doesn't mean all there is in the world is matter. You got to make a much, much stronger philosophical case for that, and you can't, ultimately. So that's my harangue on
this. Is a very necessary harangue, because that divide is still very prevalent in the culture.
Yeah.
At sort of still a high philosophical level, I still think this is relevant. How do we address the critique that says, okay, well, it's one thing to say that the knower, us, we have to have intelligible patterns inside of our mind in order to make sense of the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the world itself is intelligible, that there's a real metaphysics out there. How do we respond to that philosophical critique?
Then why does science work so well? And it's just like it's a projection of my mind. It's a Kantian kind of argument that
right.
It's simply the structuring quality of my mind. Well, then why does the world work the way it does? And then I go back to, I always cited the Eugene Wigner article, the unreasonable efficacy of mathematics in
right.
the physical sciences. I mean, why is it that I can build a bridge and I can build a house and a building and I can send rockets to Mars? Well, it's because there's got to be something really out there that's corresponding to the mathematics that I've applied to it. The unreasonable effectiveness, that's the title of the article, of mathematics in the physical sciences. I don't think you can square that with a Kantian understanding.
It's a good response. So another speaker, and we had so many wonderful speakers, we can't get to them all, but another well-known is the Jesuit priest and physicist, Father Robert Spitzer, who gave a talk called, I think this is fascinating, The Transcendent Body. Mm-hmm. What stuck out with you in his talk?
Yeah, I've been reading him for a long time, and I've heard him a number of times, and he's a wonderful fellow. I don't know if people have seen Father Spitzer. Now almost completely blind. He's struggled with his eyesight for years, and he really can't see much. But he's one of the liveliest lecturers, and he can't see notes, so there's no notes in front of him. Can give this hour-long coherent talk. Last time at the Wonder Conference, he talked about astrophysics, and this time it was about near-death experience. The thing about Spitzer is you read his books on body-soul, he'll do, Lonergan, and he'll do the high level physics and philosophy. But then he gave our symposium, I think, a more kind of empirically intriguing presentation by talking about near-death experience, which would seem to ratify this view that there's more to us than just brains and matter and motion, that there's something transphysical, as he puts it, about consciousness. I was intrigued when he began by saying there's a group of, was it physicists or scientists based in New York, I think, who, based simply on their analysis of these experiences,
that's right,
concluded the most reasonable position is that consciousness in some way survives bodily death. So he walked us through a lot of these famous cases, and probably most people know the general, that people see a white light, they go through a tunnel, and they maybe talk to their deceased relatives, and that's a very common experience. And fair enough, people might say, well, okay, that's an epiphenomenon of a dying brain, it's the brain's last hurrah or something. But then there are these really, really weird ones, where people float outside their own bodies, they see the room with, remarkable accuracy, including blind people blind from birth who've never seen,
right,
but then report with complete accuracy what was on visual display in the room. You know, people that go around the hospital and see things on the far side that you can't see. There's a lot of very, very anomalous cases that are hard to explain on purely physiological grounds.
And that are well documented.
Yeah.
There's empirical evidence showing that happens.
And they've been studying for a long time. I remember as a kid first reading all this. Was it, what's his name, Moody, or who was it that did that early research in the near-death experience? Like back in the 70s. I remember reading those books. And since then, there's been a lot more. And Spitzer's very good at corralling a lot of that data. And, you know, not that I don't think it proves things in some definitive way, but it's a certainly intriguing, puzzling, anomalous set of data. And, you know, they're I think for those of us who believe in this transphysical self, they're encouraging.
Yeah. There's also another strand to that, and that's that the body is itself, within the Christian tradition, is itself transcendent. It will continue to exist at the end of time.
Yes.
How can we give an account of that?
Well, I've used John Polkinghorne before. I brought him in at the very end of my talk. I don't know if our folks know Polkinghorne, Cambridge University particle physicist, scientist at the highest level of his field. And at midlife, he was like in his 40s, he became an Anglican priest. He went to seminary, became a priest, and then wrote very provocatively, I think, on religion and science issues. Well, one of his is the body-soul problem. And he said, I go back to Aristotle and Aquinas that say the soul is the form of the body. And he interpreted it this way, that the soul, you might say, is the intelligible, animating pattern that has maintained the unity of a body across time, even as that body has radically changed. So I use the example following him. If you see a picture of me at my first communion, I'm 7 years old, a picture of me when I'm ordained a priest, and now, there's nothing in common, physically, nothing. Every single cell of this body is different than the ones that were in that little kid and the newly ordained priest. Say, okay, well then, how am I the same? Where I would say very happily, yeah, I received my first communion.
Yeah.
I was ordained. Well, it's because, he said, of the form, this animating, intelligible pattern, which has maintained the unity of this body across time. That's an old Aristotelian paradox, of the ship, the ship, and one by one you take the pieces out and replace them. And now over 50 years, every single piece of that ship has been replaced. Is it the same ship? Is a famous, debate. Polkinghorne's answer would be, you have to look not just at the matter, but at the form. Is the intelligible form the same? Well, then Polkinghorne presses it further. Is that form preserved in the mind of God and then used to reconstitute our bodies at a higher pitch? Call them the spiritual body now, the transfigured body, the heavenly body. Right. Is it in continuity? Yeah, the same way this is in continuity to that body that little kid had when he was 7 years old. But it's the form, it's the soul that makes me I, even across these changes.
It's a really helpful way of conceiving of it.
Yeah, I thought so. To me, it brought Aquinas kind of vividly to life in terms of modern science. Because I'm sure Aquinas, I don't know if you pressed Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, if he would even think about that, of the cells of the body being replaced. Probably not. He would have understood hair falling out and that sort of thing. He probably would have seen those as accidental changes. But now that we know, then we have to find another way to account for unity.
So to conclude, Bishop, you've been working on this issue of reconciling, healing the unnecessary divorce between faith and science for decades now. Are you optimistic? Are you seeing progress out there in the culture?
Yes, I am actually. I think, go back to the New Atheists, 5 years ago when they started. They really tried to exploit this thing. And I don't think they carried the day. They had their vogue, and they did impact a lot of people, but I don't think they carried the day. And there's so many signs of people in the popular culture who are talking again about religion. And I do think, my sense is, people understand, okay, yes to science, no to scientism.
Right.
That's too reductionistic, that's too simplistic. Just the other day, because Bill Maher, I blow hot and cold because he's terrible on religion. I think he's great on wokeism and all that. But the other day I caught him saying something along those lines of like, the Bible, they didn't know anything about cells or molecules. I thought, oh, come on, Bill. So don't read Aristotle, don't read Plato, don't read Cicero, don't read Shakespeare, don't read anybody, who's not talking in a scientific way. That's just crazy. I mean, there's so many texts of great figures that convey the truth to us in a non-scientific way, because that's not all the truth there is. Right? So I hope, and I do think people see that distinction. Science, yes. Scientism, no.
And recognize that science itself changes over time
Yeah,
as well.
of
Our
course.
understanding of the cells and how they're composed, all that.
Right.
Well, Bishop, it's now time for our listener question. Okay. And apropos of today's topic, we have Ben from Montana asking about how Catholics should interpret the meaning, not just the reality, but the meaning of near-death experiences.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Ben from Montana. I was wondering what we as Catholics should think about or how we should interpret near-death experience stories. Thanks for all your guidance and inspiration.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And it's a good searching question because it goes beyond just the data. And, the data are real. There's no question about that. People have these experiences. I found pastorally, you scratch the surface of people, you start talking to people, these stories come out like mad. So they're there. Now, how do we interpret them? Now take Father Spitzer and look at extreme cases and all that. Your question is deeper, like what do they mean? We shouldn't put too much weight on them. I wouldn't say I believe in the immortal soul because of near-death experiences that people have. I think that's too strong. At the same time, I think we should take them with requisite seriousness. They're at the very least an indication, it seems to me. They're a hint of what the Church indeed holds to be the case, and they're a kind of empirical ratification of it. They're a hint in that direction. I suppose in a way it's like the Shroud of Turin. I have a great devotion to the Shroud of Turin and have studied it for years. I do think it is the burial shroud of Jesus. I do, for all kinds of reasons. But if someone said to me, I don't believe it, fine. I mean, we could have a good conversation, but I would never say, and boy, your belief in the resurrection should be based on the Shroud of Turin. No, the Shroud of Turin is a really intriguing artifact that hints in that direction. But your faith is grounded in something else, right? So I guess I kind of come down that way with near-death experience, that they're fascinating and they should be taken with respect and seriousness, but don't rest your faith upon them.
Well, thank you, Ben, for your question. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show episode, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. And I also want to add that all of the talks plus more that we discussed today on the Word on Fire show are available on the Word on Fire Institute platform at institute.wordonfire.org. Bishop, fascinating. As always, we've run out of time, but to be continued.
Great. Good being with you as always, Matt. Thanks.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.